Hi, everybody. Welcome to our monthly immigration series. As you just heard, this webinar is being recorded, so keep that in mind as you speak. My name is Ashley. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the organizing director here at the ACLU of Northern California. Carlos?
Hey everyone, my name is Carlos Montes. I'm a senior organizer with the ACLU Northern California, and I'm based out of Sacramento.
Thank you all so much for being here. I invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. Please share with us your name, your pronouns, and where you're joining us from. So tonight we're going to start with a couple of just very brief state and federal updates, but the bulk of tonight's webinar will be focused on how you can determine whether your local school district is doing everything that it can be doing to protect immigrant students. And Carlos will share with you a little bit about how you can research your district policy and then engage in advocacy if needed at the school district level. He'll also give you a better idea of what the current state law requirements are for school districts and some of the guidance that the Attorney General has issued to school districts to help ensure that they are following state law and adopting good policies. Before you ask, which I'm sure many of you are wondering, we will share with you a link to the slides so that you can view the slides after the webinar, so you don't need to be quickly trying to copy down the contents of the slides. Those will be shared with you. And later this week, we will also share a recording of this webinar. As I said, the webinar is being recorded. And my colleague Luis is also on, who might be chiming in, helping us out to respond to questions in the chat. One request that we have of you is, to the extent possible, if you could use the Q&A function to ask questions. That helps us track the questions versus trying to follow them in the chat. We're going to keep this tight. We're going to be done by 6:30. That's the goal. So we may not get to every question. We'll do our best, but feel free to use the chat to chat with each other, to share your thoughts, to share any feedback. But if you have questions, it's easiest for us to follow them if you use the Q&A function at the bottom. Okay, so let's start with a couple of state and federal updates. I'm going to warn you that the first updates that I'm going to give are not good, but we will have some good news to share in a couple of minutes. So last month, the Trump administration invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 due to what they claimed was a, quote, invasion by the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. Since then, the administration has deported hundreds of migrants to a mega prison in El Salvador called the Terrorism Confinement Center. And this prison has a mind-blowing capacity of 40,000 people, which is just really hard to fathom. I think that's more than the entire student population, including grad students at UC Berkeley. You've probably seen or read in the news that the administration also refused to turn around 2 planes despite a judicial order to do so. Planes of people being transported to this prison. And you can see in these images here just the incredible density of people being held in this terrorism confinement center. While the administration has claimed that Venezuelan migrants are gang members, many news reports have raised questions about those claims. Several people who were part of these deportations were deported and are alleged to be part of Tren de Aragua just because they had certain tattoos, including like a crown tattoo, praying hands tattoos, autism awareness tattoo, and then someone I think had crowns on both arms that said mom and dad under those crowns. So I've seen many people with these types of tattoos. There's like someone also had one of those like Jordan jumping tattoos. Like a lot of people have these tattoos, and I don't know where they came up with this association, but people are being deported and accused of being part of this gang just based on these tattoos. So it's really hard to overstate how concerning these actions are. They continue to be challenged in the courts. And on Friday, the Trump administration actually asked the Supreme Court to intervene on the administration's behalf. So we'll keep an eye on this and let you know if there are actions to be taken around these deportations. Over the past month, the Trump administration has also expanded its targeting of immigrant students who have engaged in pro-Palestine speech. Let's be very clear, the First Amendment applies to everybody in the United States, regardless of immigration status. Everybody in the United States is protected by the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and that includes the First Amendment. So it does not allow the government to retaliate against anyone for their speech. Ripping someone away from their home, stripping them of their immigration status, and detaining them solely based on their political viewpoints is clearly an attempt by President Trump to silence dissent. And that is patently unconstitutional. Political speech, however controversial some may find it, may not be the basis for punishment, including deportation. The Trump administration illegally arrested and detained Mahmoud Khalil, who is a lawful permanent resident and a recent graduate of Columbia University, as direct retaliation for his advocacy in support of Palestinian rights. Rumeysa Ozturk, who is a PhD student at Tufts, was grabbed, arrested, and detained in Somerville, Massachusetts by plainclothes federal agents this week. Also, apparently in retaliation for a Tufts Daily op-ed that she co-authored last year. You may have seen that really disturbing video footage. Both of them are now being detained in Louisiana. Then on March 5th, Young-Soo Chung, who is a 21-year-old student at Columbia, attended a sit-in to protest the expulsion of several students who were involved in pro-Palestinian activism. 4 days later, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, showed up at her parents' home. And when they couldn't find her there, they sought help from federal prosecutors, searched her dorm using a warrant that cited a criminal law against harboring non-citizens. They've revoked her green card and accused her of posing a threat to U.S. foreign policy interests. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio has claimed that more than 300 students have now had their visas revoked. So these actions are really horrific. They should concern all of us, regardless of our views about the content of the speech involved in these demonstrations and other forms of political speech. So if you haven't already, we encourage you to please take a moment to sign our petition calling for the release of Mahmoud Khalil. And Luis has just dropped that link in the chat. So thank you for doing that. Okay, I have better news. So last month, I'm going to give you an update on a case that I talked about in our webinar last month. So last month, I shared a bit about a lawsuit that was brought on behalf of a group of Venezuelans with temporary protected status, or TPS, who sued the Trump administration, represented by ACLU of Northern California and our partners, over the Trump administration's unprecedented attempt to strip hundreds of thousands of migrants of their lawful immigration status. The lawsuit accuses the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem of illegally revoking temporary protected status, or TPS, for 350,000 Venezuelans who would lose their work authorization on April 3rd, so 2 days from now, and would lose their deportation protections on April 7th. And then another 250,000 people would be affected in September, rather than all of those folks retaining their protections through late 2026. This illegal termination of their status would not only rob 500,000 people of legal status and work permits, but also really place them in acute danger if they're forced to return to a country in the midst of an unprecedented economic and political crisis. But we have some exciting news, some breaking news to share with you, which is that yesterday, a U.S. District Court judge, Ed Chen, blocked the government's attempt to strip TPS while the case moves forward. So it's not an ultimate win, but it means that people will not lose their work authorization on the 3rd, and they will not lose their deportation protections on the 7th. Those 350,000 people will be able to continue working and retain their protections as the case moves forward. This is a massive, massive victory. There's been a lot of celebration in our office today. In his 78-page ruling, Judge Chen said, the Secretary's action threatens to inflict irreparable harm on hundreds of thousands of persons whose lives, families, and livelihoods would be severely disrupted, cost the United States billions in economic activity, and injure public health and safety in communities throughout the United States. At the same time, the government has failed to identify any real countervailing harm in continuing TPS for Venezuelan beneficiaries. And then we have a quote here from my colleague Emmy, who says, Judge Chen's decision today recognizes the critical role of TPS, protecting people who cannot safely return to their home countries. This humanitarian protection cannot be stripped away from hundreds of thousands of people for illegitimate pretextual reasons. So it was really, really wonderful to hear this little bit of good news and know that while the fight will continue, and this is really just the beginning, it's likely certain that the government will appeal the decision to the Ninth Circuit and ultimately possibly to the Supreme Court. But for now, hundreds of thousands of people will be able to remain in the country and work. And so that's a really big victory. So just a big thank you to the attorneys and the plaintiffs who have been affected by this and who have been working on this case. And this is like really big, important news. With that, I am going to hand it over to Carlos for the bulk of the training. Carlos.
Hey everyone again. So maybe if folks can take some time, and I won't be able to see the chat, but it'd be great, if you can all like add on there just so we can see it later, and then you can all share with each other. If you've ever been part of a campaign that deals in advocacy, right? It could be anything ranging from a campaign in immigrant rights, criminal justice. These campaigns can look as simple as, like one of the most basic ones that I like to mention is advocating to like fill in a pothole, or maybe advocating for a policy change at the city level or at the county level with your board of supervisors. So if anybody has previous experience, doing advocacy campaigns, if you could share that in the chat, that would be greatly appreciated. So that all of you, so we can get a sense of where all folks here are at their advocacy journey. I'd like to assume that many of you are here because these issues resonate with you. You feel them deeply, or perhaps you yourself have your own journey that's led up to this point. So with that said, please do share that information on the chat. I'd love to see and read later, what's everybody's experience, what's everybody's stories, and what brings them here. So with that, I want to set the tone for the remainder of the presentation. The goal of this training is to understand the rights of immigrant students and the responsibilities of local education agencies, otherwise known as LEAs, to protect those rights. Another is to understand how to determine whether your local district is compliant with state law. And third is to learn how to take action to get your district compliant or ensure its policies are fully implemented and go beyond. I think to some of you who may be parents, who may be educators, some of you may come in with a little bit more knowledge than others. Others, might want to know how they can help other students and other parents, who probably are dealing with this right now, with this uncertainty within the school districts, within the pre-K through 12th grade program. So we really ask that, this information which will be shared with you later, that you take this on and share this information out, because that's going to be one of the main tools we're going to be able to use, to disseminate information with, local organizations, with our friends, with our family. So please do bear in mind that, when this information and presentation gets shared out, please do disseminate that information with your community, as it will be greatly appreciated. All right, so there's obviously been a lot of changes with the administration right now. Whereas it was viewed before that there were locations known as sensitive locations, federal policy no longer deems schools sensitive locations. There are still protections for students. I myself, who prior to being on the ACLU worked is a lot in like faith spaces, school policies. It's very unfortunate that this is the case, but I think the important part right now is that we come to understand, what protections students still have, and how we as community members can advocate to further ensure those policies, that they're there to protect our students. But also remind everyone that every child in California does have the right to a free public education. I can't highlight that enough. and that Assembly Bill 699, which went into effect in 2018, requires that all LEAs in California to implement additional protections. All right, so I've been mentioning this Assembly Bill 699, and some of you might be aware of it. Others of you might be asking what Assembly Bill 699 is. So Assembly Bill number 699 mandated that the Attorney General by April 1st of 2018 publish model policies. These policies are really meant to limit assistance with immigration enforcement at public schools to the full extent possible, and that is consistent with federal and state laws. And it just ensures really that schools remain a safe place that are accessible to all California residents. And when I say all California residents, I mean all those, including those who may be undocumented. As I mentioned, it just has to remain accessible to all California residents, regardless of immigration status. Another important highlight about Assembly Bill 699 is that it expressly adds immigration status to the list of protected characteristics. That's something I can't highlight enough. It adds the immigration status to the list. And also Assembly Bill 699 does the following, which is instructs schools on how to protect their students and their students' private records from immigration enforcement by one, requiring schools and their employees not to collect information or documents about students and their families' immigration status or citizenship unless it's required by law. It obligates schools to report any request for information or access to a school for the purposes of immigration enforcement to the local educational agency's governing board. And also, it obligates schools to adopt a policy limiting assistance with immigration enforcement at public schools. I can't highlight this enough. As we're moving forward in the presentation, we'll see other examples and how these model policies look like and what limits they place. But I think the most important component of this is that it also requires schools to adopt supportive practices in response to potential concerns around immigration enforcement, such as sharing information with families about their children's rights to a free public education and know your rights materials that are related to immigration enforcement. I'm sure many of us here have been at different know your rights presentations. They typically deal around student rights, immigrant rights, your rights in protests, around law enforcement. And as I mentioned earlier, one of our biggest tools is going to be presentations such as these or know your rights presentations, and that we share that information out with community members, so that there's no use in keeping that information to ourselves. It needs to be out there. So please do share this information, everything you're learning today with anybody you feel would benefit from it. So we're talking about rights. So I think one important part is the educational component of this campaign, right? Which is one of them is what rights do students have, right? So as I mentioned previously, your child has a right to a free public education, and that's all children in California have that right. They have the right to attend a safe and secure and peaceful schools. So I mean that can definitely come out in different ways, but I think the most important part is right now, given the uncertainties and the constant attack on the undocumented community, it's having schools that we know are supportive of our undocumented population and their families, because not all families in the school districts are citizens, right? That we have mixed status families. I mean, our community is very, very much diverse in California. So with that, we want to ensure that that those students have a right to be in a public school, that's free from discrimination, harassment, bullying, violence, and intimidation, and that everybody has an equal opportunity to participate in any program or activity offered by the school without discrimination. Furthermore, since we're on the topic about what rights students have, we also want to mention some of the things that those students do not have to the type of things that those students do not have to share with school officials, right? They don't have to share information that includes their passport, their visas, anything that can identify, their immigration status, the immigration status of the students, parents, guardians, and or other family members. Because as I mentioned previously, sometimes their family members who are of mixed status families, right? Not just a student, but maybe one parent or both, other family members that might reside in the household. Unfortunately, we tend to see that a lot in when it comes to immigration enforcement cases, where sometimes, unfortunately, one person is the target of an operation, but and other people end up becoming, targets of that particular enforcement activity. But all this to say is that, it's very important that we don't, that they understand that there's information that they don't have to provide to school officials. Other information is things, like social security numbers or cards. And then just when providing information for proof of students' residency or age, that we just, use the document, that you don't have these documents that could reveal information related to your immigration status. So that's just something important to highlight. But along with the rights that students have, what responsibilities do districts and administrators have? I think the main emphasis here is that school officials can and should protect students and their staff. With that, some ways in which, that can occur is that schools should share know your rights information with students and staff and widely promote the creation of emergency plans with families. It's something that, many of us, don't like to talk about what can happen in the case of an emergency, but it's something that's important, and it's even more important for families that are mixed status, right? That we have a clear emergency plan to where where a family member who's a guardian can refer to. And there's many resources that are available right now where, where families can plan their emergency preparedness plans, but it's also important, that the administrations develop clear procedures to follow in the event of an immigration enforcement action on or near school property, which takes into account students' constitutional rights, and that the district instructs all district employees or agents to send any information requests from ICE, being Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to the superintendent and legal departments, who can make the final decision as to whether and how to comply with the request. Because as we know, those who have been present at Know Your Rights presentations that deal in immigration know that many times, when an ICE officer presents a warrant, it's typically not a warrant signed by a judge. So that's also something important to understand, how to identify a judicial warrant, versus an order of removal, say, that's signed, by ICE. So that's always important. And it's really important for school districts and administrators to really reaffirm their commitment to serving and welcoming all students on campuses, irregardless of their immigration status. Okay. So another important point that we've been mentioning is that school administrators can limit the data they collect on students. Obviously, I mentioned earlier, like, what information students do not have to share with the administration. But, the administrators can go further by, not inquiring into students, into the students' information, certain information, parents or immigration status upon enrollment, that they don't do unnecessary searches on the student's background, and that they ensure that the policies regarding information sharing will prioritize protect information of students, staff, and their families. And as we're moving forward, we're going to go a little bit more into depth about how that looks like. And with that, we're going to dive into a very important portion of the presentation. I saw that my internet wasn't stable. I just wanted to ask it. Can
Looks like
everybody
you're
hear me?
back.
Yeah, can you
Okay,
repeat
perfect.
the last thing that you said, though?
Yes. So I was mentioning on my last point was that it's important for administrators to ensure that there are policies, that really do prioritize protecting the information of students, staff, and their families, when it comes to law enforcement agencies. Uh, that is when, and as we're going to dive into the next few slides, we're going to go a little bit more into how that looks like. All right, so one way in which one unique thing about AB 699 was that it created these model policies by the California Attorney General's office, which are intended to help which are intended to help school officials form practical plans on how to protect the rights of immigrant students and their families. And I want to highlight one important point here because sometimes I've noticed in conversations I've even had with colleagues and or other local advocates, we throw around a lot the attorney general's or the AG's office, but I want to really emphasize for the purpose of this presentation and for the information that's being provided, we're talking about the California Attorney General's office, not the AG's office at the federal level, but the California Attorney General's office. I want to avoid that confusion. Uh, but as I mentioned, these model policies are really meant to do form practical plans to protect the rights of immigrant students. And, not just along that, but they're really meant to set procedures in place when responding to actions and requests by any law enforcement officer for the purpose of immigration enforcement. All in all, I think the most important parts of model policies are to ensure that all schools or districts within the region, in this case the state, follow similar practices, and that the model policy ensures that there's legal compliance with relevant laws and regulation. One thing I want to highlight about California's school districts, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it is fairly close to 1,000 school districts. Everything from public to private to charter. So, I mean, no one school will have every school faces their own challenges, but it's important, that there's a way in which we can potentially streamline best practices, and these model policies really do provide a good base for those schools and for the school districts to follow. So the Attorney General, as I mentioned, the Attorney General's Office of California has developed model policies. And their intent really is to provide school administrators with policies for collecting and retaining information to prevent unnecessary collection of information on the immigration status of students and their families. We as advocates definitely want to avoid that. Um, and another point is to identify categories of students information that should not be released, that should not be released by local educational agencies, and provide model policies instructing students and families on ways to protect against the release of student information to the extent that's permitted under the law. California tends to be, California is a state that really pushes its limits on the federal government, and that's great. But there are some areas in which, even California cannot necessarily exceed its mandate. But I think that's why it's important, that we streamline that we ensure that these model policies are in effect in our school districts, because we want to be able to protect students, to the best of our abilities, along with ensuring, the protection of school administrators, that are there to advocate for the students. And then, two other points is that, these model policies were made to inform school administrators on policies and practices for responding to immigration agents that might request to access the facilities, student information or contact with the students, and to provide school administrators with policies for responding to the detention or possible deportation of a member of a student's family. And these 4 points are actually what are four of the 5 model policies that have been developed by the AG's office. All right, so as I mentioned, one of the model policies deals specifically with gathering and handling student and family information. I mean, there is a guide that's presented by the AG's office that dives deep a little bit more deeply into each of these model policies, but these are the most important points, for our advocacy, which is one, the law, and the law says and states that it prohibits the collection or documents regarding citizenship or immigration status of students or their family members unless required by state or federal law. Point number two, that that the administration never ask about citizenship or immigration status of the student and or their parent or guardian for the purposes of enrollment purposes, and that there's that it's prohibited the collection of information such as social security numbers for enrollment purposes of students. The other model policy deals specifically in the sharing of the student information as well as the family of the students information as well. So one point is that federal law requires that in most cases, a local educational agency must seek a parent or guardian's consent before releasing any student information to an outside entity. However, local educational agencies may release information without parental and or guardian consent in limited instances to certain individuals for legitimate educational interest or the release of a directory information. Right now mentioning that item right there that's indented directory information. Uh, there is a way to opt out of that directory because it's information that's publicly shared, and the school district does inform parents of the time when they can opt out. So all to say is that that's one right that parents could say, like, you know what, I want to opt out, and typically the schools inform the parents about that, because it's that directory isn't meant for you know for law enforcement purposes. It's just really meant for students to be able to communicate amongst each other, but nonetheless that information is available publicly. uh, and also, as we were mentioning, local educational agencies must give, oh, sorry, that was exactly the point I was making, that the local educational agencies must give annual notice of the school's directory information policy and afford an opportunity to refuse release of directory information. So at that point, when that notice is given, it's meant for, parents to be able to opt out of that information being released. And that no student information shall be disclosed to immigration authorities for immigration enforcement purposes without a court order or judicial subpoena. So with that particular point, I highly encourage eh, um, you all, or maybe some of you have already attended a Know Your Rights presentation that deals specifically in immigrant rights. And at that point, those presentations typically go over what these judicial subpoenas, what the court orders that are signed by a judge look like. So it's very important to be able to also identify these orders and what they look like. So I highly encourage all of you, if you ever come across one of those presentations, to take the time to educate yourself on what those orders look like. Okay, so the other model policy deals in responding to the detention or deportation of a student's family member. Uh, and I mentioned earlier about a family emergency preparedness plan. It's something nobody likes, that unfortunately not all of us like to talk about, but it's important to keep our emergency contact information updated, because unfortunately sometimes when we don't prepare properly, a list of a number of things can happen that we wouldn't intend to happen, but they could potentially. For example, here, schools should not contact child protection services, unless unless the school is unsuccessful in arranging for the care of the child through the emergency contact information that the school has, or other information or instructions conveyed by the parent or guardian. So that's why it's always important, for for, individuals, parents, guardians, to have that information provided to the school, and that to the extent possible, the local educational agency should facilitate a family's development of a family safety plan to be stored in a location known by the student, right? So it's important, of course, for that information to be updated, but it's also important to have that conversation with our student. I will say that if when you visit the website of a school district, or even there, or even when you're at a particular school, there, typically they do tend to provide a lot of information in regards to know your rights, family emergency preparedness. So it's always good to take some time to really learn more about our schools, what information they provide. Sometimes there's workshops held, not necessarily always in other schools. It could be in spaces where people practice their faith. But there's a lot of information out there, and plenty of organizations that are willing to partner with schools and other advocates in order to provide this information to the community. So an important thing in this, those were the points. Those model policies are the most important, or some of the most important parts to what the California Attorney General's office has provided. But how do I know if my district has adopted a compliant policy is a very important question to be able to answer. As as I previously mentioned, how do we know it? Like, we would know that a district has adopted a compliant policy when those policies align themselves with Assembly Bill 699, and also that the updated model policies uh have been adopted by May 2025. We all know that, like, when you advocate for a change in laws, or when you advocate for these assembly bills or Senate bills, that's only part of the work. Another important component is the follow-up, and I think this provides a very unique opportunity for folks as advocates, as community members, to do that follow-up work, right? To take this information that's being given here and be able to initiate a campaign in order to ensure, that these policies are being put forward by our school districts. So, some important ways to know that they're in compliance is that these model policies must include the following, which is some items I've already mentioned, but I can't reiterate enough, which is, one, prohibits discrimination, harassment or intimidation or bullying based on immigration status. Two, instructs schools on how to protect their students and their students' private records from immigration enforcement. Three, requires schools to adopt supportive practices in response to immigration enforcement. And just as I've been mentioning throughout the presentation, that these policies can only be further strengthened by, our willingness to really talk about students' rights, and just our rights in general. So it's, when you go on the website of the school district, typically there'll be a section that talks about know your rights, and if not, then it's important to address that issue with that individual school or the school district. So with that, one important thing to know how to do is, how do I locate my school district policy? Generally, there's, like I mentioned earlier, there's about 1,000 school districts, throughout California, and not all school districts, operate in the same way. Not all of them, have the information available in the same location, but typically the board policies and bylaws are on their website. But that's why we typically recommend you first go through the district website. Some of them are a little bit easier. They might have an up-to-date section where it says, like, oh, this is our guidance. Sometimes it's all the way at the bottom, but sometimes it's not that easy to find. So in our example, I'm going to be using Sacramento City School Unified School District. So when we go to the webpage, you'll see right here, this is the opening webpage of the school district. Can everybody still hear me? Okay, perfect. So right here, for example, if we look on the upper left side, we'll see it says district statement regarding immigration enforcement. That's one important item. Right here we see a calendar where they're talking about, different events that are happening. There's a Know Your Rights event. So some of the school districts, some of the school districts have this readily available, and it's easier to find. But in this particular example for Sac Unified School District, we would first go to the section that says about, which is located on our upper right section. Um, and next slide, please. And after we click on that section which says about, it'll take us to this landing page, which is CSUSD Board of Education. So on that, you would click on your left side where it says board policies, and that would take you to this other page, to this other landing page. It says Board of Education policies, and it allows you to utilize the GAMUT, the GAMUT service, which essentially, allows us to locate the policy, the model policies that have been adopted by the school board. And for this purpose, it'll take us to this other landing page, which, if you go on a search engine, you can type in immigration, and it'll pull up, all the relevant board policy manuals. So right here, for example, it has legal status requirements, admissions, anti-bullying, response to immigration enforcement, high school graduation requirements. And, it has the dates of when they were last reviewed. When you open them up, it has a lot more detailed information. But just a quick little fun fact, the one that's highlighted in like yellow, that has a little bit of highlight in yellow, that code number 5145, typically, you can use that code 5145 when searching for school board policies in other districts, and that would typically take you to their policies that deal in immigrant rights. Some of them might vary a little bit because due to whatever circumstances in that school district, but typically 5145 will take you to the ones that deal in immigration. If not, you can type in a search engine immigration, and that should take you to something similar. But obviously, different school districts might have their landing page look differently. I mean, this particular page, the results might look differently. So it's always important to do some research on your particular school district. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So what to do if my district does not have a compliant policy? In the case of Sac Unified School District, I mean, they complied fairly early. They were very attentive to the needs of their students, but sometimes, not all school districts, will have that information up to date, right? So I think one important thing to highlight here is that you have a right to advocate in your school district, especially if it's not compliant in its policy. Or maybe you find the policy and you feel that it's not up to date, that it's missing something. You can always set up a meeting with your school administrators. But I think before you go on to that point, it's important to create an advocacy plan in order to help you organize your goals and understand who the key players are and what you need to do to meet your goals. And with that, next slide, please. We've created this table right here that that talks about, that'll help you outline some of your advocacy plan, right? So there's our goals, our things to consider, the constituents, allies, and our opponents, our targets, our tactics and activities. And we added some beginning questions, where you as advocates can begin to ask yourself, things like, what are the goals of your campaign? Who cares enough about this issue to join your campaign? Which individuals have the power to give you what you want? And what will help increase awareness of your campaign and build additional support? So these are all important questions to ask as we're developing our campaign. Because it's important, like as I mentioned earlier, if your school doesn't have a good policy, it's essential that you create this advocacy plan and understand just who can help you reach your goal, right? In supporting students But obviously there's things that are important to understand. We have to become educated on our school districts. Who can we rely on allies? Who will be our opponents? How do we engage the school board? How can we present before the school board? Should we be talking to other folks who can support us? Things that are important too are things like, for example, when and why you would choose to begin your advocacy, say, with a school board member versus the superintendent, and or is it both, or is it important to start our advocacy with both, right? And that's where it's really going to require us to really research what the situation is in our particular school district. How friendly is our school district towards us? But that's why we created this basic outline, in order for you to really start asking yourself those important questions. Um, so some of the next steps can be, some of the next steps that we've identified here is, you can reach out to me, and that's my email. Feel free to get that information. You can email me out. You can email me if you would like to talk about any of the information you've seen here. If you have any questions or need any support with your local advocacy, we are developing an advocacy toolkit that goes into these items in much more depth, that will be available in the next coming 2 weeks, or earlier. But like I mentioned earlier, if say you've identified you've identified that your school district isn't up to compliance, or you just have questions and you like to learn a little bit more about how you can sit down with your school administrators, feel free to reach out with me, and I'd be more than glad to brainstorm with you ideas, right? We can start answering some of those questions that you saw on that outline. And or perhaps you already have a pretty good idea of what you like to do, and you need assistance in connecting with your local community organizations. I'd be more than glad to brainstorm that with you as well. Who are the local players in your region, and who can you partner with in order to create an efficient campaign? And I'd be more than glad to serve as somebody you can bounce back ideas with. So it's my email, semontesponce@aclunc.org. And if you ever have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to me. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be sharing out a toolkit with all of you that goes into depth. And when that's out, feel free to reach out with me as well. I'd be more than glad to discuss the toolkit in more depth. And we're doing really good on time. I haven't been able to monitor the chat, but are there any questions?
There haven't been many in the chat. I think, responded to all of them. Maybe let's go on to the upcoming events, and then if folks have additional questions, you can chime in and ask. All right. Of course, now I'm typing a response in the Q&A. I just hit send on that. Okay, so one thing we wanted to flag is that there is this mass mobilization happening nationwide on Saturday, April 5th. And this is around the current administration and President Trump's abuses of power, gutting the Department of Education, Social Security, Medicaid, and all of that, on top of trampling on our civil rights and civil liberties. So there are protest demonstrations, other events happening in a number of communities. You can view the map at the URL on this slide, and that hopefully someone will drop in the chat as well. And we encourage you to join one of those mobilizations. Okay, a couple of you have asked about our state legislative priorities. If you joined this webinar last month, we talked about some issues that we were hoping to address legislatively in California related to state collaboration with immigration enforcement. That legislation doesn't look like it'll be moving forward as we had hoped. However, there are a lot of other important legislative priorities that we are working on. We would love for you to join us twice. Once will be for our sort of kickoff and training. Now you can join this Tuesday, April 8th thing, even if you can't participate in the week of action, but I would really, really urge you to participate in the week of action. And I'll say a little bit more about what that is. So Tuesday, April 8th at 5:30, we will have a webinar where we talk about our legislative priorities and you can learn about the bills and how you can get involved. Then we are not doing an in-person Sacramento ACLU lobby day this year. Instead, we are doing an in-district week of action, the week of Monday, April 14th through Friday, April 18th, which is the spring recess. So the legislators will be doing work in their districts during that week. There's no activity happening in the Capitol in Sacramento. So we will be reaching out to legislators to ask them to meet with us that week. So depending on whether and how many constituents we have registered from each legislative district, that will help us determine how many meetings we can schedule and with which legislators. So if you might have some availability during that week to go in person to your legislator's office, some of the meetings might end up being on Zoom, but we're going to try to get them in person as much as possible because we find that those are better. You can sign up for the week of action. We don't have a meeting scheduled yet because we need to know who can attend before we can schedule the visits, but we're hoping that we can get as many people registered as possible this week. And then by Tuesday, April 8th, we'll have a better sense of who can attend visits. And then next week we'll get the visits actually scheduled. So sign up for those two things. If you can, you definitely need to come on the 8th if you plan to lobby the week of the 14th. But you can also attend on the 8th, but not attend the week of the 14th if you're not available. And then our next one of these immigration sessions is on Tuesday, May 6th at 5:30. I don't know what our core topic will be for that one, but hopefully we can find something interesting to share with you. Luis or Carlos, did I miss anything?
No.
Okay, then we do have a couple minutes left for questions. Seeing none, I don't know if Carlos said this, because I was responding to something in the Q&A, but Carlos is also finishing up a toolkit that covers all of the content that he just delivered in his portion and will help guide you through finding your district's policy and engaging in an advocacy campaign. It has a lot more on how to actually build out an advocacy campaign if that's something that you haven't done before, and especially if that's something that you haven't done at the school board level before. So Carlos has been working hard on that, and in the next 2-ish weeks, we should have that ready to share with you. So we'll share that with everyone who's on this webinar. We'll also post it on the website. Carlos, anything to add to that?
Nope, just want to reiterate to folks, if you grab my email, please, feel free to reach out to me. We can, if say you just want to start brainstorming some ideas, I'm more than glad to start that as well.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and hopefully we will see you on April 8th. Thank you.